Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today, we're going to provide a comprehensive outlook on Ethereum. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the Telegram channel, which you can find a link to in the description below. We also do have the premium list at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. Now, we do like to provide these overarching outlook videos on the the assets of our choice very frequently. Okay, and I just did one on Bitcoin a few days ago, and I think it's important to provide one on Ethereum. Now, Ethereum, this market cycle, has been about as resilient as I've ever seen it. And that might sound like a surprise, considering there are phases last market cycle where it went up 1,700% against Bitcoin before it dropped. But the reason why this cycle is more impressive to me so far is that, and this is what we talked about back in 2019 again, when we first started talking about it. The Ethereum Bitcoin valuation has just been on a steady and slow climb to the upside with periodic moves to the downside along the way. But again, you have to expect that you're going to get these periodic moves. And we have followed this every step of the way. I mean, if you guys have been following the channel, we started following this move way back over here in September of 2019. If you go back to my channel and go to the oldest video on it, it's Ethereum, timing the long-term momentum shifts. September 20th, 2019. And we were talking about the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation back then and how this is timing the Ethereum Bitcoin long-term momentum shift because we had been in a downtrend for so long and we were looking for, okay, it seems like we're getting to that long-term momentum shift in the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation. And the speculation back in 2019 is that it's just going to generally trend up with time. It's going to generally trend up with the market cycle. So we came up with our cycle outlook, our cycle theory, the idea that the cycle should theoretically extend well beyond 2021. That there's no reason Bitcoin needs to go to 100K by 2021, and that the cycle should in fact lengthen, and that during that time, Ethereum should methodically trend up against Bitcoin, okay? And it should trend up against Bitcoin because if we have Ethereum in our portfolio, it is arguably more risky than Bitcoin, especially from like a regulatory perspective. I think Ethereum provides a ton of value. It's a blue chip, but I would say it's slightly more risky than Bitcoin. Therefore, you should expect higher returns. If you don't get higher returns for a riskier asset, then you have to question why you hold that asset. So Ethereum has done just what we want it to do. We take on slightly more risk than we do with Bitcoin, and it's been giving us so incredible returns, okay? Now, Ethereum hasn't given the types of returns that some altcoins have given, but Ethereum is a blue chip, and it is generally trending up with time, and for the duration of the market cycle, it has stayed very strong against Bitcoin with 2 or 3 month windows where Bitcoin outperforms. So, with that said, let's talk about where we are today because we've certainly come a long way since the valuation was 0.02. The Ethereum valuation against Bitcoin was 0.02 since 2019. So where are we today? Well, this is where we were back then, and this is where we've come. Okay, a pretty crazy move. We drew these lines on the channel a couple years ago as well, and they've done fairly well at respecting them. Of course, it's not perfect. So when we talk about some symmetry that we've seen here in the markets on the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation, also look at the Ethereum USD valuation with the Ethereum Dominance, and so on and so forth. All right, so it's going to be a bit of a journey. So the first thing we should look at is just focusing on the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation. We talked about timing the long-term momentum shift. But one of the things we've discussed is there has been a little bit of symmetry in terms of on the way down to then on the way up. And some of that symmetry can just be seen by drawing local tops that we've seen in the past and noting that this local top that we saw back in September, whether you take it to the wick and this wick, or you take it to the close of the daily candle here and this daily close here, this was a fairly strong resistance level for Ethereum to break through. And then once we broke through it, came down, we broke through it, and then we kept on moving, okay? So with that in mind, the other, and by the way, that resistance level was at around 0.04. I'm sure a lot of you guys remember that. I mean, this was only a little over a year ago. And it was interesting because we saw the Ethereum valuation against Bitcoin go up a lot in the summer of 2020, and then it bled like crazy against Bitcoin when Bitcoin went on a parabolic rally. And so you should be prepared that if Bitcoin were to either go on a parabolic rally or if it unfortunately keeps going down, then it could present some weakness to Ethereum. But I gotta tell you guys, I mean, even with Bitcoin bleeding recently, Ethereum is still holding up incredibly strong. So, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it just provides more and more reason why Ethereum is such a great part of my portfolio. Okay, not financial advice, of course. Now, 0.04, a huge resistance level to break through. Now, what's interesting is we've been stuck here at around 0.082 for a while. We got some rejection here. We're getting some rejection here. Obviously, crypto investors are no stranger to rejection because we see it all the time. But look, this is where we got rejected back over here as well. And similar to the 0.04 level, the first attempt was failure. The second attempt got slightly above, and then it was the third attempt that took us past. So we had one attempt here. The second attempt we got rejected at. And now I think we're just sort of waiting for a potential third attempt. And once we break it, once we decisively break this level, clearly the next target would just be 0.01. Okay, or not 0.01, 0.1. Okay, 0.1. I'm so used to saying 0.0 something with the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation. No, it'd be 0.1 would be the next clear target. And then above that, you're talking about 0.12 and 0.15. Okay, so my speculation is that the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation will likely make it to 0.1 this market cycle. And I think, as far as I'm concerned, you know, there's a lot of talk about, are we in a bull market? Are we in a bear market? Look, I still think we're in this overarching market cycle that's taking us from the end of 2018 all the way out to 2022, 2023, okay? I do think the cycle could extend out until 2023. I've said that since 2019 on the channel. It's a pretty weird concept for a lot of people to grasp, especially with the idea that every cycle has to be quote-unquote 4 years. But we've always pushed back against that. And you can already see that if we have any hopes of Bitcoin going to 100K at this point, then we need to see an extended cycle, right? The cycle has to lengthen for those valuations to come true because there's just simply not enough time to do it this year, all right? So with that in mind, the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation today is 0.083. And what's interesting is that historically in Q4, the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation bleeds. We've seen this happen literally every single Q4 since inception for Ethereum. It's always bled against Bitcoin in Q4. And then it normally skyrockets in Q1. Now this Q4, it's been doing relatively well. I mean, it hasn't gone parabolic or anything, but if you look at 3-month candles, it's still up a very modest 21%. Okay, so some of you might be saying, well, does that mean Q1 has to be bad? I'm not saying that. I mean, the one thing I will say is that I'm certainly not going to be betting against Ethereum. Okay, Ethereum looks incredibly strong to me, and I have no intentions on betting against it. So with that in mind, with Q1 coming up, you know, I mean, if Bitcoin doesn't put in any major moves, then we could, I think there's a good chance we're going to see Ethereum's valuation against Bitcoin continue to climb. And clearly the next level of resistance would be 0.1, which would be a pretty important milestone to get to. Okay, so I think Ethereum Bitcoin looks relatively good. Obviously, there's always downside in the event that Bitcoin has a sustained dump. But I would argue that some of the best evidence out there that the market cycle still has a ways to go is the strength that Ethereum continues to show. If we were looking at an end of cycle type scenario for Bitcoin, I would expect Ethereum to be a lot weaker than it is today. You know, like if Bitcoin were trading at 47K and Ethereum were at $2,000, like if it had dropped precipitously after Bitcoin did and went all the way back to 2K or something with a $47,000 Bitcoin, then I'd be like, you know, you'd have to start thinking, all right, well, Ethereum's looking relatively weak. That means alts are probably looking even weaker. But Ethereum's looking incredibly strong right now, despite how weak Bitcoin looks. Now, that doesn't mean that Ethereum can't go down against the US dollar. It always could. And in fact, the bull market support band for Ethereum is currently ranging from around 37 to 3,800, which we're still above. And by the way, Bitcoin is below its own bull market support band. So Ethereum is still actually above it. And you know, I'd say it's doing relatively well. Now, something we should note before you take that off to the bank is that earlier this cycle, during the summer lull, Ethereum remained above the bull market support band for a few more weeks, and then ultimately it did drop below it after Bitcoin did. So I'm not saying that it has to do that this time, but if you're thinking that 3,700, 3,800 has to be the local bottom, it could be, especially if Bitcoin picks up the pace, but you always have to consider that we could still come down and test some lower levels as well before trending higher. Now, another thing to look at from the Ether USD perspective is to consider the same thing that we've always said, and that is you have to expect periods of sideways movement during a bull market. And one of the reasons is because, you know, if you look over here, Ethereum more or less went from $1 to about $10. So about an order of magnitude up. And after it had to go sideways for about a year before it could really sustain higher prices. So when you have a major move in the market where the prices go up 10x, obviously the buyers down here want to take profits. And you're going to have a lot of new buyers up here, but they're still buying the bags, some of the bags of the guys down here. Not all of them, but some of them, of course, will want to take profits. And then you get another move up, and you have people still buying up here, and they're buying the bags of these guys and these guys. And then eventually you get to a point where the market can no longer sustain it, and then you enter a bear market, and then it wipes all these guys out who bought up here, and it also wipes these guys out who didn't take profits. And the only people that are still in the money at this point are the people that bought over here, or the people who took profits up here. Okay, so that's sort of what we're looking at. And you can see that, again, this lasted about a year for Ethereum, about a year. And then this one was about half a year, okay? Where are we today in this one? Well, you could argue that Ethereum has more or less been going sideways. Let's just call it from between 2K more or less to 4K with slight moves to the upside and the downside of that for about 2/3 of a year, if not a little bit more. So the argument being is something similar. Well, we went up by over an order of magnitude. You would expect a long consolidation phase before we could theoretically trend higher. That's what I would think. I mean, it makes sense. People were buying over here for a long time. They're going to want to take profits for a long time. The people that are coming in new to the market that are buying are most likely buying the bags of some of these guys. But eventually, I would argue that these guys are going to run out of bags that they want to sell, and then we'll ultimately be able to sustain a move higher. But the trick is that this can't go on forever without eventually entering into a bear market. So, you know, imagine we do get, you know, some type of move up to the upside. I don't know how high it's going to go. I mean, I would expect 10,000 as a reasonable target. We could even go as high as 20. It's hard to know. Of course, price predictions, everyone has one. They all stink to some degree. And so I'm imagining continued sideways movement for a little while, especially with Bitcoin looking somewhat weak at the moment. And then eventually, hopefully, the guys over here, and by the way, I mean, if you follow this channel, we were the guys over there at one point. But hopefully the ones that are taking profits over here, eventually I imagine they will run out, and then we'll ultimately trend higher. But we still could have a ways of chopping to go. So I would argue that this general overarching reaccumulation phase ranges more or less from 2K to 4K with slight moves to the upside and the downside during that reaccumulation range. We've gone slightly above 4K. We've also gone slightly below 2K, but it doesn't change the fact that we've spent most of the time between $2,000 and $4,000, which is very similar, you know, to the phase over here where we spent most of the time between approximately $7 or $8 and around $16. So let's call it $8 to $16. So again, about a 2x reaccumulation window. Okay, a 2x reaccumulation window between $8 to $16, a 2x reaccumulation window between $2,000 to $4,000. Now, I do think that eventually Ethereum will break higher, and we'll continue the market cycle. And a lot of this goes back to the whole idea of market cycle theory, the idea of lengthening cycles for Bitcoin. And one of the things we've noticed before with Bitcoin too, and I know this is an Ethereum video, but we have to understand where Bitcoin is. Historically, the party's over if we go below the fair value line. Okay, as long as we stay above it, we should have more room to go. If we go below it, we're looking at a long reaccumulation phase. Now, unfortunately, this indicator is not great for identifying a bear market because by the time you go under it, we're already at the accumulation phase. So capitulating at this point is probably not the best idea, considering that by that point you've already experienced the worst of the bear market. But what it can do is get you mentally prepared if we were to go below it. So I'm looking for Bitcoin to stay above this fair value line and then hopefully continue this cycle on for quite a bit longer. So if you take that in mind, if you keep that in mind, the idea of lengthening cycles with market cycle theory on lengthening cycles, and let's switch this over to the daily time frame if you're unfamiliar with what I'm talking about. You look at Bitcoin market cycles, and the whole idea is that every cycle lengthens as you measure it from the market cycle bottom. So I'm going to continue to speculate that it will continue to lengthen. And some people have now, I think, come to terms with the idea of lengthening cycles since their predictions have not panned out, and now they've kicked their predictions down the road by a month, and now they're going to say it's going to be in January. But realistically, the chances it's in January are pretty slim to none, considering that prior cycles have lengthened by 1 to 1.5 years. So I would argue that we have quite a ways to go for the Bitcoin market cycle, and therefore Ethereum has quite a ways to go as well. And we're probably going to continue chopping for a while. I don't really care if we come down here and then go back up, or if we just go back up now. doesn't really matter to me. You should note that if you were to overlay, of course, there are some similarities, and I'll just overlay it for completeness, even though we've shown it in many other videos. You know, this cycle over here had a move like that, and you can see there are a lot of similarities between these types of moves. Okay, so, you know, is it possible that Ethereum has to go back down to the bottom of the channel? I mean, it's possible, but also something else we've noticed is that oftentimes when you overlay these fractals, they tend to not repeat each other exactly. Okay, so certainly you don't want to take that to the bank because there's no guarantees we go back to that level. And if you zoom in, there's already been a lot of differences between the two. For instance, if you overlay that one, you know, we had this local top here, we came to the bottom. We had another local top here, we dipped back down a little, we had another surge. This surge took us higher. If you, yeah, well, maybe I should overlay this as close as I can. This surge took us higher, and then we started bleeding for a while. So, you know, what I'm looking for is continued consolidation for a while. Doesn't mean we have to go back to $2,000. Okay, it doesn't mean we have to do that. We could. I mean, we could go down to those levels, and I imagine that would be relatively scary. I mean, imagine what kind of a ride that would be if Bitcoin or if Ethereum came all the way back down here and then broke back out in the middle of 2022. The point is this channel is focused on long-term investing, not day trading. If you're trying to get cute with the market and time it and say, all right, well, you're going to buy it at a few $100s less than what it is today. I mean, I've been DCAing Ethereum. I mean, ever since it was, I mean, for more than just markets, for more than just this market cycle, but even in this market cycle, I mean, I've obviously had videos going back to when it was like $100. So it certainly has come a long way because now it's at $4,000, only about a year and a half to 2 years later. So, you know, and then another fractal you could look at that doesn't look quite as scary in terms of a reaccumulation zone would be this one. And that one you can see if we change this to a different color, so we can kind of see two different potential paths that Ethereum took last cycle. If I just briefly move the yellow one out of the way, so you can see what the blue one did. A pretty similar move if we overlay this, right? A pretty similar move. So we came up to the top, back to the bottom, up to the top, and then we actually broke out. Okay. So, you know, what I'm thinking is probably, you know, it's probably not going to be either of them. It could be a mix of the two. Maybe we do something like in the middle and then we break out. I don't know exactly, but I would expect Ethereum to put a new all-time highs in 2022 and potentially continue on moving until 2023. But I think it is highly speculative to count on that at the moment. The other thing we can look at is it's easy to certainly look at Ethereum's Bitcoin valuation, but how does it perform against other altcoins? Because one of the reasons I hold altcoins is because I expect them to outperform Ethereum in the same way that I expect Ethereum to outperform Bitcoin. And if an altcoin bleeds against Ethereum, then who cares? I mean, who cares if it goes up 20% against the US dollar if it bleeds against Ethereum? So you have to ask yourself, what if it bleeds against Ethereum? And so one of the ways to look at that is actually to look at the Ethereum Dominance, which accounts not only for the Bitcoin valuation of Ether, but also how it's faring against altcoins. And even against the entire asset class, the dominance has continued to move higher, and now it's coming in at around 21.35%, okay, which is up from about 7% earlier this cycle, and about 7% up from this video that we made back over here in 2019. So Ethereum has been standing the test of time. It is a blue chip of the asset class. It is outperforming Bitcoin, which is what we would expect, considering it is taking on slightly more risk. Of course, you could even argue that it's not taking on more risk, depending on your perspective, but from a regulatory perspective and just Bitcoin being around longer, and market cap, of course, it is slightly more risk than Bitcoin. And we also do know that in bear markets, Ethereum gets hammered a bit more harder than Bitcoin does, to say the very least, okay? Additionally, if you calculate out your Sharpe ratio for Bitcoin and Ethereum, your risk-adjusted returns, it does still say that it should be slightly more weighted towards Bitcoin than Ethereum. But if you want to maximize your returns, if you don't care about the risk, then you can go up the efficient frontier. The higher you go, the higher expected returns, but the more risk you take, and it actually corresponds to more and more Ethereum and less Bitcoin if you are feeling like you want to take a little bit more risk. Okay, so market outlook for me, if I'm being completely honest, I think we have a little bit more chop to do. Okay, I don't think Ethereum is on the cusp of breaking out at the moment. I would argue that at the very least we have many more weeks to go before we're going to be looking at new all-time highs. It could even be yeah, potentially a few months, depending on how long it takes Bitcoin to get back on track. You know, whether we bounce here and go up, whether we come down here and then go up, or if we do repeat that other fractal and even come back down to the bottom of the range and then go up. I still would argue that no matter what path we take, that we should still see a fairly bullish 2022 for Ethereum, in line with the idea that the market cycle for Bitcoin should theoretically lengthen based on what we've observed in the past, and the fact that Bitcoin is only at, you know, 2.5x its prior all-time high from 2017, which, you know, I think you could dubiously speculate that the current valuations for Bitcoin could actually be closer to its next bear market bottom. Now, that doesn't mean we can't go back down first before trending higher, but, you know, we're only 2.5x, not even 2.5x up from the prior all-time high of 2017. So it does seem unlikely to me that Bitcoin's going to go back to $10,000. It could certainly go back to 42K. It could go back to 40K. I have to imagine that the only way that Ethereum could possibly go back to this level would be that if Bitcoin were to go back to 30K. I mean, if Bitcoin came all the way back down here or something, then sure. I mean, it's possible that Ethereum could go back to the $2,000 level, because that's where Ethereum was when Bitcoin went there. So I imagine that this scenario would only happen if Bitcoin failed to hold 42K, 40K, and then went back down to 30K, and then bounced. But arguably, overall, I think Ethereum looks incredibly bullish. I would argue that we're simply continuing to be in long reaccumulation for more or less the last 2/3 of the year. Probably have a couple more months to go at the very least before we're going to see a sustained break to the outside, especially since Bitcoin's continuing to show some weakness, right? So I do hope that this video has provided a decent outlook on the market cycle. If you don't agree with it, that's fine. This is just what I think is going on in the markets. Sometimes it's boring, sometimes it's not. Right now, the markets are relatively boring. So just come up with a plan now, stick to it when the markets get crazy, and rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. Thank you guys for tuning in. Subscribe if you're not subscribed. Check out the premium list at intothecryptoverse.com if you want to know how I am navigating these markets, and I will see you next time. Bye.